During our meeting, they were explaining to us why they had requested the troops and what they were seeing, and we asked them if they could really go into more detail about the type of craft that they were seeing. In their explanation, they were seeing most of them at night, lighted craft, circular, and we knew, coming from the Naval Air Test Center, we tested everything there, that we had nothing like that we tested. So I asked them, I said, what did our government tell you they were? And they said, your government said they were experimental, probably experimental Russian bombers. The flight that we had our encounter on was from Keflavik, Iceland, to Argentia, Newfoundland. And as we took off on the 9th of February, and of course we flew through midnight, which it meant is about 30 minutes after midnight, this is the position we were in here, and that's where the encounter took place. The flight was normally about 10 hours, but that night we had a 60-knot wind, and it was a headwind. And about maybe 300 to 400 miles outside of Keflavik, out of Argentia, I'm sorry, I saw something below the horizon on the water that looked like approaching a city at night. It was just kind of an ambient light, no definition whatsoever, but the same thing that you would see if you were approaching a large city at night. So I watched it for a while. It was about 1 o'clock, and then finally I called Kingdon's attention, who was sitting in the right seat, who was route checking me, and he took a look at it, and he didn't know what it was. We couldn't figure out. There was nothing out there. We had passed over the guard ship. Back in those days, they had a guard ship that was between Iceland and between Newfoundland. The guard ship had given us the latest weather. The weather was clear. There was no northern light activity, which they give as part of the weather report. And we had ship plots. There were no ships plotted in that area, so we asked Koger if he could give us another fix and find out if we were really on course. We thought maybe we had drifted. We were seeing Labrador, the coast of Labrador, or maybe the tip of Greenland. So he said, no, we were right on course. So we watched it for a while, and we were drifting to the right of it, and where our heading was 222 degrees, 225 degrees in that direction. As we became, I would say, we were at 10,000 feet. I would say it was 40 miles away originally, in the vicinity, 40 miles away. When we were about 25 or 30 miles away, we could see defined lights, and there was a pattern on the water. So with that pattern, we couldn't figure out what was going on. Maybe the Navy was doing something that was highly classified, recovering something out in the ocean or something of this nature. So that was our thoughts. And it was a circular pattern, and it was very large. I mean, I couldn't estimate the size of it. So I sent the crew chief back to get the other plane commander, Al Jones, because they wanted to land at Argentia. So when the crew was coming up from back aft, there were 31 passengers, and we had 2 VP crews, which had pilots also, and patrol plane pilots. And at the time that they came forward, the lights went out on the water. There was nothing on the water. This was about 15 miles away. I mean, it was just dark. Now, standing behind me was the navigator, the radioman, and also the plane captain, plus them. The cockpit was full, and there were heads all over the place. And all of a sudden, we saw on the water a yellow halo that was very, very small, about 15 miles away. And it came up to 10,000 feet like that, a fraction of a second. And I thought it was going to go right through us. And I disengaged the autopilot, pushed the nose over, because I was going to go under it at the angle it was coming toward me. So what happened, the minute that I did that, it was up at our altitude, and I could see nothing outside of the cockpit but this craft. So I didn't know which way to go. And then all of a sudden I heard a racket. I didn't know what it was. And I said, Fred, what the hell was that? He looked around, he says, oh, he said everyone was ducking in the back of us, and they collided, and they're all laying on the deck back there, scrambling on the deck. So when I looked back, it wasn't there. And he says, it's over here on the right-hand side. Now, it was about a mile or so away on the right-hand side, and it kind of drifted forward maybe to a position maybe 5 miles away, and that's where it stayed with us for quite some time. This is when we could first see, it wasn't above our altitude, it was below our altitude, but it's still above the horizon where you could see the side of the craft. you could see the dome, and you could see the color around the perimeter of the craft. And then we knew that it was a friendly encounter. We knew it knew we were there. We knew it came out to see us, but we didn't think at that time that the reason it did this is because they wanted to show us what the Icelanders were talking about. So we watched it for a while, and Al says, well, let him get in the seat. So I let him get in the seat, and he disengaged the autopilot, was going to chase it. Now we had a ground speed of, his headwind of about 60 knots, so our ground speed was maybe only 120, 130 knots. And so he wasn't going to go too far in chasing this thing, but he did turn to chase it. So I decided I would go back aft to see how the passengers reacted, and also talk to the doctor that was back there. He used to make the trip over there. He had a daughter going to school in London. And so I went to him first. I said, Doc, did you see what we saw? And he says, yeah. He says, he looked me straight in the eye. He says, yeah. He says, it was a flying saucer. He says, I didn't look at it because I don't believe in such things. Well, it took me a couple of seconds to recognize it. He couldn't believe, being a psychiatrist, in that. So I went back forward and I said, Al, whatever you do, don't tell anybody we saw anything. He'll lock us up as soon as we get on the ground. He said, it's too late. He said, I just called Ganner to control to see if they could track this by radar. So that's how it got out. So when we landed at Argentia, the Air Force was there, and they interrogated us. And the captain that did the interrogation did a real good job, but you could tell that this wasn't his first time that he'd ever interrogated anybody as far as these craft were concerned. The water was yellow around. Now, since then I've learned, not long after that, I learned from, we'll say, the boys upstairs, why we saw different colors as it was coming toward us. The colors were around the perimeter. It was kind of at an angle to where you could not see the back ring of the craft. It was around the perimeter of the craft. And it turned from a yellow to an orange to almost a fiery red, and then almost a purplish red. And they said that had to do with the amount of energy being used or dissipated. It had to do with the power, so to speak. And so when it slowed down close to us in a fraction of a second, it was back to the yellow range, and it was foggy all around it to where you like a plasma or a mist or something of this nature. Now, as far as any lights, there were no lights that we saw. This was just around the perimeter. When it was out where most of the crew members or the people in the back of the airplane saw it, it was fire and color. Every report, every one of them stated that in the report that we got out of the archives. Everyone said fire and color, ring, fire and color. We had like a knowing. When that question was asked, it was 300 feet that came in my mind. And when I got the report out of the archives in 1991, I'd never seen anybody else's report. Everyone had been anywhere from 250 to 350 feet in diameter. And when I talked to others, they said, well, just something that they knew and estimated. Now, the velocity when it left us was estimated from between 1,000 miles an hour to 2,000 miles an hour. And when I looked at the report, Al Jones estimated 1,800 miles an hour. Mine was 1,000, another one was 1,500 miles an hour, in that range. It turns out that the radar report, which I've never seen, said it was 1,800 miles an hour. So the other plane commander was sitting in the seat, took my seat. He hit it right on the nose. And of course, I was at the Naval Air Test Center. This is where we trained the astronauts, and this is where we had our test pilot training school. This is where we did all the highly classified tests of aircraft, and to my knowledge, we had nothing that would anywhere near approach to speed or anything that was circular.